very much for the opportunity to talk about a topic about which I have given some considerable consideration over time, which I think remains very important. Today's seminar is really about innovation ecosystems, but I want to think more broadly about some other questions around how innovation ecosystems yes, here we go. How innovation ecosystems really relate to the broader processes of change that take place within economies. I want to think about, or want us to think about, the ways in which how the nations and cities transform, particularly when they're affected by quite significant changes. I also want to consider the question about, do ecosystem processes, innovation ecosystem processes, make a genuine contribution to the transformation of economies, whether it's at the city scale or the national scale? And if they do work, why is it they work? And I think these are an important set of questions. So to deal with these issues, I'm going to actually begin by considering some conceptual issues. I want to begin next one, thank you. I want to begin by considering the explanatory frameworks which I think best help us understand how the economies of cities and regions change, and the contribution, and this then leads us to understanding what sort of contribution and in what ways innovation ecosystems can bring about that change. So if we move on to the next slide, please. Theoretical work or conceptual work that's relevant here includes a number of really very important and very powerful theoretical frameworks. One of the most powerful and most discussed theoretical frameworks is the evolutionary economic geography approach. Obviously derived from evolutionary economics, evolutionary economic geography seeks to understand how the economy of cities and regions changes by understanding what happened in the past and how that shapes the opportunities into the future. It is an approach where it brings about change through an acknowledgement of what it refers to as path dependency, which is the bottom box in that particular slide. It takes the ideas of Darwinism, about adaptation, about survival, about death of actors, in particular the death of firms, and it also ties it into ideas derived from complexity theory, understanding what the complexity does not mean chaos. Complexity means difficult to understand patterns, but patterns that can be discerned. So path dependency theory and evolutionary economic geography is important because it specifically focuses on the role history plays in shaping the future that a place has. The reality is that any city cannot evolve to be like another. Adelaide cannot evolve to be like Sydney for a whole host of reasons. Perth cannot evolve to be like London. Its history, its trajectory of growth, of change and development determines what is viable in terms of a market economy. Evolutionary economic geography has very considerable strengths. For a start, it places a great emphasis on innovation, and this discussion today is about innovation ecosystems. The discovery of novelty is seen to be critical, and by novelty they mean innovation. The discovery of novelty is seen to be critical because it's through that discovery process that change takes place at the firm level, and those firms both survive, but also most importantly grow. And as they grow, they reshape the broader context in which change is taking place. It also acknowledges that the assets, skills and technologies of the past play an important role in shaping the opportunities of the future. The assets that we have in this place shape the types of industry we're able to bring into the workforce and bring into or use to attract firms who might choose to come to the city. Evolutionary economic geography has a firm focus on individual enterprises and assumes, of course, that change takes place through market processes which are continuous, ongoing, which in large measure result in incremental change over time. We could move on. One of the problems with evolutionary economic geography is it doesn't allow for a role to be played by anything apart from the firm in any clear way. Governments are not seen to have a role, universities are not seen to have a role, the community or the population as a whole is not seen to have a role. It does not also accommodate well the idea of abrupt shocks or changes in the economy. And I must say my own perspectives are very much shaped by the fact that much of my academic life has been focused on failure, the failure of industries, the failure of firms and how you respond to that. And what we do know is that in many places, a major shock such as the closure of an industry, such as the car manufacturing industry, can result in success or can result in failure down the track. But evolutionary economic geography cannot provide any explanations about why we get those different outcomes. There is a second very important body of conceptual work that we need to acknowledge, and that's the work on institutions, which also draws its inspiration from economics, institutional economics. And the images I show in this slide are drawn from a very impactful paper by Andres Rodriguez-Pose, who's at the London School of Economics, on institutions and regional development, institutions and regional economies. His contribution came in the wake of a long-standing debate, a long-standing literature on the role of institutions in shaping how places change over time and how places grow. Earlier work by Amin and Thrift, particularly from 1999, has suggested that places with more institutions are more likely to grow. If you've got more progress associations, if you've got more active city councils, if you've got more active industry associations, if you have greater support from the community and greater support from entrepreneurs, the argument was that you would grow. Now, this argument was difficult to sustain because other work has then shown that places that are otherwise similar with the same number of institutions can have very different outcomes. Some grow, some don't grow. Something else is going on. And Andres Rodriguez-Pose, it is a Spanish name, I have just a little bit of trouble with it, argued that if we think about how a region should change over time, you have two components which are reflected in a bicycle. In the first instance, you need strategy to determine where you go. And we've all participated, I'm sure, in strategic planning sessions for economic development at some scale or another. The second is you need an institutional structure to bring that strategy to life, to make it happen. And ideally, you have a bicycle that looks, as we see at the very top of this slide. But in fact, what we see can often be something very different. It's the penny farthing. So you have an enormous strategy, but you have no institution behind it to deliver on that promise. So growth is much more perilous and far slower than it would otherwise have been. In some instances, and we're now looking at option B, we see an outcome where we might have the right framework in place, but in fact, neither strategy nor institution is fit for purpose. And for the third instance, we have the aspirations of growth, but there's no strategy and there's no institution, so nothing happens. Andres argued that for a region or a city to grow and transform successfully, it didn't matter how many institutions you have, All that really mattered is that you have the right mix. You need fit-for-purpose institutional structures to actually deliver on growth. And that includes appropriate government institutions interacting appropriately with the private sector in large measure. Now, the problem with this framework is that he said it has to be the right mix. But what is the right mix? How does that contribution, as insightful as it is, help us understand the way forward? We can't look at a town, whether it's Alice Springs or Rio de Janeiro, and say, that's the right mix or that's the wrong mix. And we certainly wouldn't be a practitioner trying to structure future growth plans on the basis of the insights from that slide. It's a challenge, and so therefore we need to think a bit further. Could I have the next slide, please? The third conceptual framework really is derived from the work of Markus Grilish and Markus Otteratua, both from Northern Europe. And they argued that when we look at the ways in which regions and cities grow and change over time, you can identify that new opportunities arise, much in the way that evolutionary economic geographers argue. And they say, well, actually, opportunities arise all the time because we're inventing new technologies. And those new technologies are fundamental to growth, which is an EEG concept. And some of those new technologies can only be implemented by a particular actor or agent. They might be the only one able to do it. There are some things within our economy and the economies of most nations which only governments could do, for example. There are other things that only individual companies can do. For example, only Tesla can build a Tesla car factory, if I put it as simply as that. There are some things that are specific for regions. Some regions have a monopoly for natural reasons or because of historical legacy on the production of some forms of activity. And if I think about the Whyalla steelmaking facility in South Australia, for example, it has a region-specific opportunity in green earth steel production because of its massive assets, potential and otherwise, in renewable energy. And finally, there are time-specific opportunities. The region or city that can take advantage of a new technology and commercialise it and monetize it first and foremost can establish a growth trajectory that others will never catch up. Which is why in Australia, and I think in many other parts of the world, everyone's rushing for green hydrogen. If you establish preeminence in that role, the belief is that you can establish a pathway, as in EEG terms, that leads to growth. So opportunities emerge all the time. Their framework steps away from the simple firm versus government approach. It argues that in fact, there are three different types of agents who can actually bring about change in an economy. Firstly, as we would all acknowledge, there are entrepreneurs, fundamental to the delivery of innovation and the creation of innovation ecosystem. Central to the growth of a region, without doubt. And they can be leaders, and we can all think of examples both in the published literature and daily life about these sorts of entrepreneurs. Secondly, there are governments. Governments can be leaders as well through their actions if they choose to be so, though in some cases they do not choose to do so. And it's important to acknowledge that when we talk about initiatives that are stimulating innovation ecosystems, they almost invariably have some sort of government input. Many of us would be aware that even Silicon Valley had its origins in government expenditure, particularly US government expenditure on defence in the 1960s and 1970s. The miracle that is Silicon Valley, the much touted example, is a product of government expenditures initiating a process of change, which entrepreneurs then developed into new directions. And finally, the community as place leaders can also bring about change over time. With some colleagues, I recently published a paper where I argued there is a third important dimension, hence this cube. And that dimension is the stories we tell. So having the opportunity and having the leadership is one thing, but unless we create stories, unless we create narratives of change, we cannot bring about a transformation in an economy. We cannot stimulate an innovation ecosystem. So importantly, we argue it's often a story about private sector-led growth or a story about public sector-led growth, and sometimes it's a story about both working together to bring about change. If we could move on. So operationalising this as an idea, what we see is we can think about it as a Venn diagram. A region with high potential for growth is a region where there's considerable overlap between a narrative of change, strong leadership bringing about change, and also an environment rich in opportunities that can be commercialised or exploited. And that's a really important point. Each region will have its own Venn diagram, each city will have its own Venn diagram, but it does tell us about its capacity to bring about change. And of course, my argument for this presentation is the innovation ecosystem is part of that Venn diagram. It's only part of that Venn diagram, but it's embedded within it. Next slide, please. I just wanted to touch very briefly on the challenges of competitive globalisation. We all acknowledge that we live in a globalised world with globalised economies. Australia in particular has one of the most open economies in the OECD. We export a lot, we're trade exposed, and we bring on change. When we think about, next slide please, when we think about the drivers of growth, what we find is it's often a hairline between success and failure. It's often a very, very narrow margin between success and failure. So this is taken from the OECD 2012, promoting growth in all regions, and the OECD, of course, has produced stellar work on why places grow and why places don't grow. If we have a look at it, what are both the impediments and the enablers of growth, we see so much overlap between the two. Policies can be both an enabler of growth and an impediment to growth. Human capital is the fourth ranked impediment to growth and the fourth ranked enabler of growth. Geography is the sixth ranked enabler of growth and the fourth ranked impediment to growth. It's a fine margin between success and failure in terms of regional and city economies, always within a globalised economy. And that's a really important point. And I think this for me, this leads to the point around why innovation in ecosystems are so important. If we could move on. So these are survey data taken from essentially a firm that provides advice to corporations seeking to establish new branch plants or move their headquarters in the US. And what you see over time in those data is really the thing that has increased most and seems to be the most impactful in terms of where firms want to locate is in fact the availability of skilled labour. Things such as the right to work, which used to be very important in the US, is no longer that important. Union profile is no longer that important. But 93% of firms who responded to that survey said skilled labour is important, which of course reflects back on the point I made earlier when I was discussing evolutionary economic geography about the fixed assets and capabilities within a region shaping growth. When you think about it, there aren't many things that appear to be that important when shaping where relatively mobile will locate, which talks to my mind at least about the fragility of development and how city and regional economies can get a fixity on development, how they can lock in, to use the language of evolutionary economic geography, how they can lock in a growth potential over time. So the next slide, thank you. So now I just want to spend a little bit of time talking about innovation ecosystems. And in my discussion around innovation ecosystems through this presentation, what I want to focus on is the broad concepts of innovation ecosystems and the ways in which particular forms of fixed assets, and I'll be giving examples at the end, contribute to their success or enable their success, and the ways in which they correspond to those conceptual frameworks that I was discussing earlier in this presentation. And I think that's a really important point to make. Those conceptual frameworks allow us to see why these particular initiatives emerge and why these particular initiatives may be impactful or have been impactful in the past. Next slide, please. Thank you. So the first point I want to make is really the words on these slides. Innovation is important. It's important for growth. And I really love the quote from Paul Krugman, the Nobel laureate. Productivity growth isn't everything, but in the long term, it is almost everything. Productivity growth, how we get more value, better value out of the work we do. So it's not about working harder or more, it's about working smarter. And that is an agenda that obviously speaks to innovation and the ecosystem that supports it. It is fundamental to the economy at the individual level, the enterprise level, the city level, and the national level. We look to achieve productivity growth. And if you've been following recent media reports, we can acknowledge that Australia has had very uneven productivity growth over recent years. So productivity growth is important, which means that anything that can raise productivity is actually going to be fundamental to economic success in the long term. Next slide, please. So I thought I'd just talk about a number of different ways in which other authors, other researchers have considered and discussed productivity, innovation ecosystem. I think the language in this slide is rather colourful and rather interesting, but it does speak, I think, to the zeitgeist of much of the innovation ecosystem literature and presentation in public forum. It's often seen to be something that is dynamic, fluid, cutting edge, of a generation that is younger than me by some considerable margin. In this instance, it's taking the language of music in large measure, the language of trade, and advancing it to suggest that there are different ways in which a vibe can be established, different ways in which there can be a sense of energy and purpose established, all of which are pathways to the exchange of information, the exchange of knowledges, and the exchange of competencies. So have an orchestra where a keystone player comes in and brings about growth. We have a bazaar where a local company searches for partners and then makes that take on. There's a jam central where people almost spontaneously come together and that results in a forward thrust in terms of productivity. And then we have a mod station, but with some changes around how that happens. I think what's really important for me in this sort of language is that the innovation ecosystem, much more than the evolutionary economic geography literature does formally, really locates itself within a collectivity, really locates itself as an enterprise involving many. Evolutionary economic geography almost places the firm as an individual actor that's acting in isolation, and then we combine up the decisions and actions of individual firms to get a result that's impactful at the regional scale. This, of course, is an approach that emphasises interaction. This is an approach or a way of thinking about innovation ecosystems that emphasises the ways in which firms deal with each other, feed off the energy of each other, and are supported implicitly here by governments actually allows this process of innovation to take place and productivity growth to emerge. And I think that's a really important point. In many ways, it talks to what the economists would call untraded interdependencies between these firms. And for me, at least, what that says is that once we start talking about untraded interdependencies, we're talking about much of the language that have always been attached to things such as clusters and cluster building, for example. We could move on, please. Besant provides a really good set of insights into how we should perhaps think about innovation and its manifestations. Innovation is a process, it is not an event, it is not an end stage. It is effectively a party that should not end. It is a party that you do not want to end. It's about a learning process. It's about the acquisition of both codified and tacit knowledge. It's about one element of novelty. It is about creation. It isn't necessarily about adaptation, but adaptation can be part of it. There is no single pathway. It can go in many ways, in many events. It's about solving problems. It's about dealing with the complexities of the modern economy and the modern business environment and finding solutions as quickly as possible. And importantly, I would argue, it's about being supported by others to find solutions, whether they're your peers or whether they're government agencies or whether they're something else. It inevitably involves entrepreneurship, and that is a key point here. It must be led by entrepreneurs. And it's path dependent, which takes us back, of course, to those initial insights about evolutionary economic geography. If you were to ask me what I would think would be the most likely emergent industry in Adelaide, South Australia, I would argue it's probably something based on artificial intelligence, because we are a nation and world leading site for the Australian, in that field, through the Australian Institute of Machine Learning, AIML. It is path dependent. Next slide, please. My own thoughts are, it's important to acknowledge in our discussion of innovation ecosystem that they are not placeless. They have a geography. They are not virtual. We have innovation ecosystems where face-to-face connectivity still matters, or at least established face-to-face relationships still matter. They are often embodied. They have a physical presence. And that physical presence, that materiality, is actually very important because it is a great enabler of ongoing interchange. They are commonly the subject of government action and direction, and I'll give some examples about this in just a few minutes, but that's an important insight to have. Governments have intervened because they are aware of Krugman's insight that productivity growth is important. And they know that in the developed world, the only pathway to further productivity growth is through innovation. And this is one promising channel to deliver that innovation and productivity growth. I would also argue that over time, both the practice of economic development and also academic work has begun to explore these issues under different labels and under different times. So if we go around the world, we find different expressions. And if we go to different time periods, you find different expressions of the drive to generate and sustain productivity growth. So we find science and technology parks. There's a literature, there's a whole series of clusters that have been built over time based on the work of Michael Porter. We have business incubators, business accelerators, we have technology precincts, and in Europe in particular, we have smart specialisation strategies. In many ways, they are either different expressions of the innovation ecosystem, or they contain elements of the innovation ecosystem, which is now finding a new form of expression and a new way of being delivered. Importantly, in all those instances, we see that governments have clearly been important in many economies around the globe in their delivery. Could we move on, please? So let's talk just briefly about bringing innovation ecosystems to life. So what I want to talk about now is my hometown, Adelaide in South Australia, and some of the changes it has gone through over time in terms of its responses to major shocks in particular, and how government has tried to bring about change. And in particular, I want to consider how it has brought to light, how it has embodied that change, how it has embodied the innovation element, but also how it can also relate back to those theoretical or conceptual elements I introduced at the very beginning of this talk. We could move on, thanks. Before I do that, I just want to make a couple of key points. One is, as many of us who are academics would know, the academic literature often lags by several years practice. We wait for something to be developed theoretically, it often gets picked up by practitioners, and then down about 10 years later, we form an opinion about whether it was a good idea or not. It's an inevitable outcome of the academic process. And my first important point to make is that if we think about historical innovation ecosystem attempts, there's now a fairly robust evidence base in the academic literature, double-blind, peer-reviewed, that essentially says that clusters have been successful. And I think that's important to acknowledge because it speaks to the promise of innovation ecosystems. Now, the two authors mentioned there do provide some insight into what works and what doesn't work, being located close to a city centre, containing a mix of businesses, offering a wide array of supports, which includes, of course, a role for government, provide accommodation that ramps up from very small to much larger places, and being owned by a not-for-profit organisation. So they say, yes, clusters get a tick as a prototype innovation ecosystem, and yes, there are some dimensions that make some more successful than others. We could move on, thank you. And if we then look more briefly at clusters from Kettles, he also found, I think it's a he, Kettles also found that clusters were fundamentally successful in what they could achieve, particularly those that were naturally occurring, so had an entrepreneurial base and were then further accelerated and developed through inputs by government and government recognition. They work best, of course, when the foundations are strong. I think that's a very key point in terms of Kettles' finding. We'll move on again. I'll give just a couple of examples. So this is an example that was given, I've taken from some work I did with my colleague Jiří Blešček from Charles University in Prague. And this is South Moravia in the Czech Republic, or Czechia as it tends to be called now. And essentially, South Moravia was a disadvantaged region in Central Europe. It obviously had the impact of coming out from behind the Iron Curtain in the 1990s, etc. And about the year 2000 experienced a major shock because a major foreign investor moved into the firm and after 12 months moved into the city of Brno and then exited just 12 months later, creating a major sense of loss and disappointment. So in exchange, as a way of finding a new pathway, they created an innovation centre which set out using the leadership of local businesses, but also the community, but drawing upon the resources of governments, including the European Union, to bring about change in its economy. And I think the data is actually quite remarkable in terms of the clarity with which we can see change taking place through an innovation agenda. So they were tapping into the programs of the European Union over 2 time periods. If we look over the 12 years from 2004 to 2016, we see a remarkable growth in STEM-related research. We see a remarkable fall in unemployment in the region, and we see a remarkable growth in that place as a hub for innovation and learning in STEM-related fields. It simply gives proof to the argument that innovation ecosystems can generate substantial growth that looks to be sustainable. Thank you very much. The other point I'd make is that there's a clear argument for why governments are involved. And while the drawing might not be as clear as I possibly have made it, essentially government involvement really is about these pipelines. You either have a pipeline of firm creation where you start off with a small number of entrants and come out with a smaller number of exits, or that is surviving firms, or you start off with a wide funnel expanded by government intervention, expanded by innovation ecosystem growth, coming out with a wider pipeline of successful firms down the track. Next slide, please. And this is the European model example of how you stimulate innovation, or how you create essentially an innovation ecosystem. Smart specialisation, which I often refer to as S-cubed or SSS, smart specialisation strategies, funded quite substantially by the European Union, going through a process of entrepreneurial discovery, as they call it, where local entrepreneurs work with government officials to identify new technologies, the opportunity space I was talking about before, identify new technologies that could complement the existing assets of that region in terms of productive economic growth, seek to introduce those new technologies and generate ongoing economic development over time. So it seemed to be a continuous iterative process of entrepreneurial discovery, and also a process of looking outside established patterns of development to find new opportunities, new economic markets, etc. The focus here, of course, is on finding unrelated variety as well as related variety as a way of identifying where the best opportunities exist for the set of businesses within that firm. And that use of the term, the set of businesses in that firm, is quite specific because it is simultaneously a firm or enterprise level focus and also a more collective focus as well. We could move on. I now just want to finish off by talking about the South Australian experience and talk about the ways in which this state has gone through a sequence of experiments, if you like, all of which have acknowledged the importance of moving beyond simple market processes to having direct government involvement to a particular end. And I think the trajectory has been that over time, governments have become more involved, have taken a greater role in steering outcomes, have become more engaged with entrepreneurial activity, and have come to look to a different set of outcomes over time. I could have the next slide, please. So this slide is taken from the Tonsley Park development, which is in southern Adelaide, approximately 12 kilometres south of our CBD. Tonsley Park has been redeveloped from a car assembly plant, which was originally run by, first of all, Chrysler and then Mitsubishi. And it has been developed as a large-scale economic development site with residential development attached to it on the same site also, or near to it. It's been taken up enthusiastically by particular groups. So it's been taken up by, for example, the Flinders University have gone in there and put their engineering programs there. There are a number of large-scale institutional or government organisation investors moved into that, including a key mining institution, as well as our applied tertiary applied skills training organisation, which we call TAFE. But the origin of Tonsley is interesting. So Tonsley was the third major plant to close in the period post-1970. The first major plant to close was Woodville, which was a former General Motors Holden plant. And when that plant closed, no plans were made by government for the site. It was left to the market. And it turned into very low value, very low employment outcomes. Tonsley was seen to be a much more active response, a much more directed response by government to make sure that its future use met societal objectives and goals, its future use generated employment, and its future use was an economic asset, not necessarily just large-scale retail development. Tonsley continues to be a work in progress, and it continues to be able to claim successes. And I think that's important. It's acknowledged as being an innovative landscape, it's acknowledged as being a different land use, and it has about it a much more positive story than many of its predecessor large-scale closures. We could move on. The second side I want to talk about is the most recent closure or set of closures that were to take place in Australia. So this is the General Motors Holden plant at Elizabeth, which was actually the last operating automotive plant or original equipment manufacturer, OEM plant, operating in the country. Closed on the 20th of October 2017, as the slide says. And it was a major shock to its community. And its community is outer suburban, relatively low SES. And this site was not picked up by government, but was in fact picked up by a private developer or property development group, to be more precise. And it was used for other purposes, including it's been used as a small scale or relatively small scale private business incubator, managed workspace, whatever language you want to use. Interestingly, there is no large-scale narrative about this new site. It's now called Lionsgate. We know that there are some businesses there, but it is not open to the public, and there's no discussion about it being an important force or driver for change in the Adelaide or South Australian economy. It probably also has a very low profile within the community in which it resides. We could move on. We then turn to the last of the three examples I'll give, which is Lot 14. So unlike the previous two, Lot 14 was not an automotive site, but it was a large site very close to the CBD, in fact, right in the CBD. Can we get the next slide, thank you? The one after that. One after that, sorry. One after that. Oh, maybe I missed it. We'll go back to the beginning. Thank you very much. Actually, I'll take that one you just passed, thank you. So Lot 14 actually sits right next to the formal CBD on North Terrace, Adelaide, South Australia. It was a former hospital site of considerable size, not an easy site to redevelop because it had asbestos, because there were buildings from the 1950s. But it is an incredible location in terms of the ways in which development takes place. And I would refer to you some of the comments I made earlier about the success of clusters and clusters being successful if they're located close to the CBD. This is right on the CBD. Go back again, please. Previous slide, thank you. So Lot 14 was actually the old hospital, a new hospital was built, the old hospital was emptied out. And Lot 14 was taken on as a premier project within the South Australian government, in many senses of that use of language. It kept the attractive buildings and it saw the demolition of the unattractive and the dangerous buildings. And it in many ways embodies many of those elements of dynamism and change that we acknowledge as being fundamental to entrepreneurial ecosystems. Could I have the next slide, please? So some of the key points I want to draw your attention to. Pretty much the first thing they did is they established a business incubator on that site. And they brought in a specialist company that runs incubators to actually manage it on behalf of the government. So an entrepreneurial mindset to drive entrepreneurial change. And this particular incubator really is a sort of a grow out phase incubator with a strong focus on information technology in particular. But they also use that site to host important institutions. So it's got mission control for the new Australian Space Agency, which was sourced and funded from Canberra. So it's been an important asset there. It's also the site with the Australian Institute of Machine Learning, which belongs to a university that is not the University of South Australia, but is still to be admired. So we have the interchange between town and gown, or between academia and business, potentially always available. We move on. We have a development opportunity also in terms of creating a new landscape. And the process of demolition and reconstruction provides a very visible symbol of change happening, which is assumed, of course, implicitly in all of us to be positive change. Old, unattractive buildings being replaced by something new and much more attractive is seen to be part of a story of positive change that we can all relate to and accept implicitly and explicitly. We could move on. And it's a process of quite fundamental change, and it's a process that will take place over time. So it's a story where change is taking place at a very hurried pace as a priority of business and also government. But it's also a change that's taking place over a considerable time span, which gives an era or an air of sustainability and endurance and long-term impact that's very powerful. It's the sort of thing that people can look at once and understand that this is a good thing that's happening. If we could move on again, please. And it's not just a place of technology. It's a place where they're going to build the new Aboriginal Art and Culture Centre to represent all the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples of Australia. And it will be a place of culture, a place of interaction. It will be a place where they create informal spaces for businesses to be involved in meetings, for informal activities to take place, for interactions to take place, taking advantage of the full vibe of the bazaar or the orchestra or whatever it is that we're looking for. There are large corporates being brought into this site. So there's the elements of the orchestra and the bazaar taking place there. So Telstra is coming into the site, Amazon's come into the site, they're integrated with some of the key government institutions, etc. New startups are being encouraged to develop over time. There are funds to support the startups, as you would expect. We could move on. This is the slide I was looking for before. This one, I knew I had it somewhere. So this slide just points out, A, that this site of development and redevelopment is taking place right on one of the key corners of the city. That's a very attractive environment, of course, gives a very positive vibe, and it's directly opposite one of the campuses of the University of South Australia, which of course is a wonderful asset for them as well. One of the points I would make for an Australian audience, of course, is that this is an important initiative because it breaks with the past trends of putting innovation activities in suburban locations, Mawson Lakes, Tonsley, to a certain extent Lonsdale, and even the Thebarton Bio-Innovation Precinct, and brings it into the CBD as a business activity where the hustle and bustle that innovation ecosystems must create is more likely to occur. It's one of the most accessible locations in the city, and is something close to institutions of knowledge in a high prestige, high value environment. To move on, please. Another photo of the Aboriginal Arts and Culture Centre. And then the next slide, thank you. More architecture drawings of what is likely to take place and what they believe will take place. Clearly, there is a focus on amenity. Clearly, there is a focus on both combining the young and the new in terms of the architecture. And the focus is on the interactions that will be facilitated through this process. Ideas such as a common cafeteria and other places where people can meet informally and exchange ideas and knowledge. One more, thank you. So I've talked for long enough. I'll stop. To conclude, I think I would make just a few basic points. One is that innovation ecosystems are fundamental to economic success in this century. So every place that's going to be successful of any scale in terms of population needs to find a way to stimulate innovation in some form or another. It may be in specific industries such as arts and tourism, for example, or it may be more broadly. But there is a need to be part of the knowledge economy for the 21st century. Second point I'd make is that innovation ecosystems have many components which are identifiable under different names and in different ways in different parts of the globe. But the underlying premise remains exactly the same. Knowledge economy, mobilise it, integrate, govern action, private sector investment and dynamism, and add whatever additional resources you can through either community action or through key institutions such as research institutes or universities. Many of the components of innovation ecosystems have a demonstrated track record of success. So it can give us confidence in further developing and further promoting innovation ecosystems. So if there's a policy implication from this presentation, it's that it's a call for action. We need more of this, not less of it. We need more involvement with innovation ecosystems, not less of it. The recognition of the innovation ecosystem as a whole is important is new. We've previously focused often on individual parts. The cluster concept for a start was often just focused on what private firms did. In Australia, many science parks were government promoted and had very little engagement with industry, particularly smaller industry. Once we adopt an innovation ecosystem approach, we think more broadly, and that makes the concept or concepts more powerful. And my final point is that if we acknowledge now that innovation ecosystems and their components are effective, we can begin to understand why they're effective. And they're effective because they really bring together the trinity that Grealish and Sothoratua identified. They place an emphasis on the new opportunities. They're forward-looking, they're not backward-looking. But they're not just trying to grasp the latest technology and apply it without thought. What they do is they recognise the existing assets in a region and what they're capable of doing and what they're capable of supporting and try and bring them to bear. And that's a really important insight. Secondly, these sorts of innovation ecosystems, particularly as we see it find expression at Lot 14, don't think it's either the government or the private sector or the community. They acknowledge and they tap into the resources available in all three domains. They make use of private investment and dynamism. They make use of government involvement, government investment, and government strategy. And they also acknowledge the importance of community and community engagement. And to a certain extent, I think the Aboriginal Heritage and Culture Centre is a really good example of how an innovation ecosystem is grounding itself in the community, on the community dimension. And finally, initiatives such as Lot 14 can be successful because they're a story. They are something concrete, quite literally, but they're also a story. They're a story of change. They're a story of growth and growth potential that is evident to all who look. They're a story about government or the private sector or both working together. As a species, as a culture, as a nation, we look for stories. And that is a very powerful factor in influencing our attitudes and therefore our behaviours. I don't think we can overlook that factor when we try to understand why innovation ecosystems work. It's an attractive concept, and this makes it an attractive reality. Thank you very much.